April 30th, 1945, the Soviet flag was raised above the dome of the Reichstag. This moment became a symbol of victory over Nazism and went down in history as one of the most iconic scenes of World War II. But the famous photograph turned out to be staged, and the real story of the assault is full of myths and distortions. Today, we will examine how the Red Army actually took the lair of the fascist beast, what price was paid for this symbolic victory, and why the truth turned out to be more dramatic than any legend. Like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to share your opinion in the comments. What do you think about the fact that the famous photo of the flag being raised over the Reichstag was staged? Does this diminish the feat of the Soviet soldiers, or, on the contrary, show the skill of the military correspondents? The Soviet Union's propaganda machine created a veritable mythology around the storming of the Reichstag. Heroic Red Army soldiers with red banners in their hands stormed the lair of the fascist beast, crushing the last strongholds of the Third Reich. This image, reproduced in thousands of films, books, and monuments, has become an integral part of the collective memory of the Great Patriotic War. But the reality turned out to be much more complex and interesting than any propaganda cliché. Behind the beautiful slogans lay dramatic events in which heroism and tragedy, precise calculation and chance, individual bravery and mass heroism were intertwined. The storming of the Reichstag was not just a military operation, but a symbolic act whose significance went far beyond tactical objectives. Yevgeny Khaldei's famous photograph, in which a Soviet soldier hoists a flag above the dome of the Reichstag, has been seen around the world. However, few people know that this picture was not taken at the moment of the actual storming, but the next day, specifically for history. The photographer reshot the scene several times to achieve the desired effect. Moreover, in the final version of the photograph, the extra watch on the hand of one of the soldiers was retouched so as not to create the impression of looting. This fact does not diminish the feat of the Soviet soldiers, but shows how myths about the war were born. The real story of the storming of the Reichstag is no less dramatic than its propaganda version. Moreover, it allows us to better understand the scale of the feat and the price that had to be paid for victory. Western historiography has also been free from myths for a long time. Some authors exaggerated the resistance of the Reichstag's defenders, while others downplayed the role of Soviet troops in the final phase of the war. The Cold War left its mark on the interpretation of events, turning historical research into a field of ideological struggle. Only after the archives were opened and new documents appeared was it possible to reconstruct the true picture of events. Modern historians gained access to the memoirs of those who directly participated in the assault, commanders' reports, medical records of the wounded, and many other sources that made it possible to separate fact from fiction. It turned out that the real story of the storming of the Reichstag is no less exciting than its mythologized version. It includes the heroic deeds of individual soldiers, gross mistakes by the command, and random circumstances that changed the course of events. This story is about people, not symbols, about specific events, not abstract ideas. The storming of the Reichstag lasted several days and was a complex military operation involving various units of the Red Army. The German Parliament building was turned into a veritable fortress, with each floor having to be taken by force. The defenders used all the possibilities of the massive building for defense, turning the corridors and halls into a labyrinth of death. The Berlin operation began on April 16, 1945, and became the final chord of the Great Patriotic War. By this point, the Red Army was already on the outskirts of the German capital. But the fiercest battles were yet to come. Adolf Hitler turned Berlin into a fortress, declaring his intention to defend the city to the last soldier. Planning for the operation began long before it actually started. Joseph Stalin personally coordinated the actions of three fronts: the First Belarusian under the command of Georgy Zhukov, the First Ukrainian under the command of Ivan Konev, and the Second Belarusian, commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky. Each front was assigned its own tasks, but the main goal was the same: to capture Berlin and put an end to the Nazi regime. The Reichstag played a special role in the plans of the Soviet command. This building was seen not simply as one of the city's landmarks, but as the main political symbol of Germany. The capture of the Reichstag was supposed to demonstrate the final defeat of Nazism and the triumph of the Soviet Union. Stalin understood the propaganda significance of this moment and demanded that the Soviet flag be hoisted over the German parliament building. The German command was also well aware of the symbolic significance of the Reichstag. The building was included in the defense system of central Berlin and was heavily fortified. Ammunition depots were located in the basements, firing points were set up on the floors, and anti-tank ditches were dug, and wire barriers were installed around the building. The Soviet command assigned units of the 3rd Shock Army under the command of Vasily Kuznetsov to storm the Reichstag. The assault groups included the most experienced and trained units, many of which already had experience in urban combat. The soldiers received special training for street fighting and storming fortified buildings. The artillery preparation for the Berlin operation was one of the most powerful of the entire war. Thousands of guns of various calibers rained down a barrage of fire on German positions. However, unlike many other targets, the Reichstag was not subjected to massive artillery bombardment. The Soviet command was afraid of completely destroying the building, which was to become a symbol of victory. The first Soviet units approached the Reichstag on April 28th, but immediately encountered fierce resistance. It turned out that the Germans had turned the building into a veritable fortress, with every hall and corridor prepared for defense. The massive walls, numerous underground rooms, and complex layout of the building played into the hands of the defenders. Soviet intelligence discovered that not only regular Wehrmacht units were stationed in the Reichstag, but also Volkssturm units, a people's militia, as well as foreign volunteers from the SS troops. Many of the defenders understood that they had nowhere to retreat and were prepared to fight to the end. The fanaticism of part of the garrison turned every room into a battlefield. Thus, by the time the assault began, the Reichstag was a well-fortified position, whose defenders were determined to put up desperate resistance. The Soviet troops had to not only capture the building, but also break the enemy's will in an extremely difficult urban environment. The Soviet troops' path to the Reichstag lay through the destroyed streets of Berlin, each of which had turned into a battlefield. The German command organized the city's defense according to the principle of concentric circles, in which each block became a separate fortress. The Red Army had to literally fight its way through the city blocks, suffering significant losses from snipers, bazookas, and ambushes. Particularly fierce fighting broke out in the government quarter, where the main buildings of Nazi Germany were located. Every house here was turned into a stronghold. The basements were connected by underground passages, and machine gun nests were located on the roofs. Soviet sappers had to blow holes in the walls, using explosives to create breaches in the enemy's defenses. the command of the 3rd Shock Army developed special tactics for urban combat. Assault groups consisted of 15 to 20 people and included machine gunners, sappers, flamethrowers, and snipers. Each group was assigned a specific target to capture and acted relatively independently, which allowed them to react quickly to changes in the situation. Soviet artillery played a special role in street fighting. The guns were moved directly to the front line and fired directly at German strong points. Often, the distance between the firing gun and the target did not exceed 200 or 300 meters. The artillerymen risked their own lives, but provided the infantry with the necessary fire support. The German defenders used all the possibilities of the urban environment to resist. Faustpatronen became the main anti-tank weapon of the defenders, allowing them to strike Soviet armored vehicles from ambushes. Snipers hid in attics and ruins, posing a constant threat to the advancing units. The advance to the Reichstag was complicated not only by enemy resistance, but also by the destruction in the city. Many streets were littered with debris from destroyed buildings, which made it difficult for vehicles to move. Sappers had to clear passages under constant enemy fire, suffering heavy losses. On April 29th, Soviet troops approached Königsplatz, where the Reichstag was located. However, the last 200 meters to the building proved to be the most difficult. The Germans turned the square into a zone of continuous fire, installing machine guns in all the windows of the Reichstag and neighboring buildings. Every attempt to approach the building was met with a barrage of fire. The Soviet command understood that a frontal attack across the open square would lead to unjustifiably high losses. The decision was made to bypass the Reichstag and attack it from the rear after first capturing the neighboring buildings. This tactic required more time, but it allowed them to save men for the decisive assault. By the evening of April 29th, Soviet troops had secured positions in the immediate vicinity of the Reichstag, preparing for the final assault. The soldiers knew that one of the hardest battles of the war awaited them, but they also understood the historical significance of the upcoming operation. The Reichstag was not only a symbol of German statehood, but also a powerful fortified structure, ideal for defense. The building was constructed at the end of the 19th century, according to a design by architect Paul Wallet, and was distinguished by its massive walls, complex internal layout, and numerous underground rooms. These architectural features turned the Reichstag into a natural fortress. The German command made maximum use of the building's capabilities for defense. In the main hall, where the German parliament once sat, machine gun nests were installed to cover all entrances. The marble columns served as excellent cover for the defenders, and the high ceilings allowed them to fire from different levels. The Germans paid particular attention to fortifying the basement. It housed not only ammunition and food stores, but also a medical station and the garrison command post. The thick basement walls provided reliable protection from artillery fire, and the labyrinth of corridors made it difficult for attackers to advance. The Reichstag garrison consisted of about 500 men and included units of various branches of the military. The core of the defense was made up of Marines under the command of Captain Anton Heide, who were highly trained and fanatically devoted to Nazi ideology. They were joined by Volkssturm units and foreign volunteers. The building's fire control system was organized in such a way that each corridor and stairwell could be fired upon from several positions. The Germans installed machine guns not only in the windows facing the square, but also inside the building, creating a multi-layered defense. Snipers took up positions on the upper floors, from where they could hit targets on the distant approaches to the building. The defense of the Reichstag was commanded by Major General Helmuth Reimann, an experienced officer who had fought throughout the war. He understood that it would be impossible to hold the building for long, but he planned to inflict maximum damage on the attackers and delay their advance for as long as possible. Each day of defense gave other units the opportunity to organize resistance in other areas of the city. Soviet intelligence managed to obtain fairly accurate information about the Reichstag's defense system. Prisoners revealed the location of firing points, the size of the garrison, and ammunition supplies. This information allowed the Soviet command to develop an assault plan that took into account the building's features and the defenders' tactics. The architectural features of the Reichstag created certain advantages not only for the defenders, but also for the attackers. The numerous entrances allowed simultaneous attacks from different directions, and the large number of rooms made it possible to establish a foothold inside the building and fight in sections. The massive walls protected the attackers from outside fire. The dome of the building, which towered over the central part of the Reichstag, was to play a special role in the upcoming assault. It was here that the Soviet flag was to be raised, symbolizing the final victory over Nazi Germany. The path to the dome lay through the entire labyrinth of the building, every meter of which had to be wrested from the enemy. Thus, the Reichstag presented a serious challenge for the Soviet troops. Storming this building required not only courage and determination, but also tactical skill, the ability to fight in confined conditions, and the ability to overcome well-organized defenses. Soviet troops made their first attempts to storm the Reichstag on April 29th, but they ended in failure and heavy losses. The command underestimated the strength of the defenders' resistance and the complexity of the task ahead. The frontal attack across the open square turned into a bloody massacre, where every meter of advance cost the lives of Soviet soldiers. The first attack began early in the morning by the forces of the 150th Rifle Division under the command of Major General Vasily Shatilov. The soldiers attempted to cross the square in front of the Reichstag under cover of artillery fire, but German machine gunners opened deadly fire from the windows of the building. The attackers suffered heavy losses, unable to take cover in the open space. The situation was particularly tragic for the tanks that were supposed to support the infantry. German grenadiers with bazookas turned the square into a graveyard for Soviet armored vehicles. Several tanks were knocked out right at the steps of the Reichstag, and their crews died without even being able to leave their vehicles. The remaining tanks were forced to retreat under the cover of neighboring buildings. An attempt to flank the Reichstag also failed. The Germans organized a circular defense of the building, setting up firing points in all the windows. Soviet assault groups attempting to approach the building from the Tiergarten Park came under crossfire and suffered heavy losses. The advance slowed down and then stopped altogether. Analysis of the initial failures showed that the assault on the Reichstag required a radically different tactic. Direct attacks across open space were doomed to failure due to the enemy's strong firepower. It was necessary to first capture the neighboring buildings in order to be able to fire at the Reichstag windows and suppress the German firing points. Coordination between different units also became a serious problem. Units from different divisions participated in the first attacks, but they did not interact well with each other. The lack of a unified command led to attacks being carried out in a disjointed manner without the necessary support from artillery and aviation. The losses on the first day of the assault were significant. The 150th Rifle Division alone lost more than 200 men killed and wounded, without achieving any significant results. These casualties were painful for the soldiers who understood that the war was practically over, and death in the last days seemed particularly meaningless. The German defense, on the other hand, proved its effectiveness. The defenders of the Reichstag managed to repel all attacks, while preserving most of their forces. The morale of the garrison even improved after successfully repelling the first assaults. The commander of the defense, General Reimann, received reinforcements and additional ammunition. The Soviet command was forced to admit that it had underestimated the complexity of the task. More thorough preparation for the assault, better reconnaissance of the target, and coordination of the actions of various branches of the armed forces were required. It was decided to temporarily halt the attacks and prepare more thoroughly for the decisive assault. The failures of the first day were an important lesson for the Soviet troops. They showed that even in the context of a general offensive by the Red Army, individual targets could offer serious resistance. The assault on the Reichstag required not only bravery, but also professional skill, careful planning, and the skillful use of all available means. After the failures of the first day, the Soviet command radically revised the plan for the assault on the Reichstag. General Shatilov was ordered to stop frontal attacks and focus on methodical preparation for the decisive assault. Time was working against the Germans. Every hour of delay reduced their combat capabilities, while Soviet troops received reinforcements and improved their tactics. A key element of the new tactics was the capture of the buildings surrounding the Reichstag. Particular importance was attached to the Ministry of the Interior, which was located next to the Parliament and could serve as a springboard for the attack. Capturing this building would allow Soviet troops to fire on the Reichstag windows from close range and suppress some of the German firing points. Preparation for the assault included a thorough study of the building's layout. Soviet sappers surveyed the underground communications and discovered a way to penetrate the Reichstag's basements through neighboring buildings. This information radically changed the plan of operation. Now the main strike was to be delivered not through the main entrance, but through the underground rooms. Artillery preparation was organized in a new way. Instead of a massive bombardment of the entire building, the guns were tasked with suppressing specific firing points. Soviet observers located the German machine guns and passed the coordinates on to the artillerymen. Pinpoint strikes were intended to weaken the defenses without completely destroying the building. Particular attention was paid to the preparation of assault groups. Soldiers studied the building plans, practiced actions in confined conditions, and learned to coordinate their actions with sappers and flamethrowers. Each group was assigned a specific task and area to capture. Commanders conducted several training sessions on a model of the building. Psychological work with the personnel played an important role in preparing for the assault. The soldiers were explained the historical significance of the upcoming operation, emphasizing that the capture of the Reichstag would become a symbol of the final victory over fascism. Many fighters perceived the upcoming assault as personal revenge for all the suffering that the war had brought. The Soviet command also took care to create reserves in case of protracted fighting. Additional units, ammunition, and medical supplies were brought to the Reichstag. It was clear that the assault could drag on for several days, and it was necessary to be able to replace tired units with fresh forces. The German command did not waste any time either. During the lull, the Reichstag's defenses were further strengthened. New ammunition was delivered to the building, and additional mines and tripwires were installed. Volkssturm soldiers received a crash course in street fighting and were deployed to key positions. The Germans paid particular attention to mining the building. Explosives were placed in the most important structural elements so that, if necessary, individual parts of the building could be brought down on the attackers. This measure was intended not only to cause damage to Soviet troops, but also to make it difficult to use the Reichstag for propaganda purposes in the future. By the evening of April 30th, all preparations for the decisive assault were complete. Soviet troops took up their starting positions, the artillery received their targets, and the assault groups underwent final briefing. The historic night was to bring the long-awaited denouement to the many days of battle for the symbol of Nazi Germany. The decisive assault on the Reichstag began on the night of May 1st, 1945. On April 30th, at around 10:30 p.m., Soviet artillery opened fire on pre-identified targets. Unlike previous shelling, this time the guns fired with precision, seeking to suppress specific firing points rather than destroy the entire building. The first to attack were assault groups from the 150th Rifle Division under the command of Captain Stepan Nostroev and Senior Lieutenant Alexei Berest. Their task was to penetrate the building through underground passages and capture the first floor, thus opening the way for the main forces. The groups acted covertly, using the destruction and smoke screen for camouflage. Simultaneously with the main assault, a diversionary attack was launched by other units. Soldiers of the 171st Rifle Division attacked the Reichstag from the front, drawing the attention of the defenders. This tactic proved effective. The Germans concentrated their fire on the false attack, allowing the assault groups to approach the building unnoticed. The breakthrough into the building took place around midnight. The group led by Sergeant Mikhail Kantaria and Junior Sergeant Meliton Varazashvili managed to penetrate through a breach in the wall on the first floor. The first few minutes in the building were relatively calm. The German sentries were taken by surprise and did not have time to raise the alarm. Soviet soldiers quickly occupied several rooms and began to expand their foothold. However, as soon as the Germans realized that the enemy had entered the building, a fierce battle began. The defenders tried to cut off the Soviet groups from the main forces by mining the passageways and collapsing part of the ceilings. The fighting turned into hand-to-hand combat, where it was not tactical skills that played a decisive role, but the personal courage and physical strength of each fighter. Particularly, fierce fighting took place on the stairwells. Each floor had to be taken by force, overcoming the resistance of German machine gunners and grenadiers. Soviet sappers blew holes in the walls, allowing them to bypass the enemy's most fortified positions. Flamethrowers burned the Germans out of hard-to-reach shelters, but at the same time risked setting the entire building on fire. By dawn on May 1st, Soviet troops controlled a significant part of the first floor and several rooms on the second floor. However, the Germans still held the upper floors and the staircases leading to the dome. The fiercest fighting continued in the main hall, where German Marines had created a powerful resistance stronghold. German attempts to organize a counterattack and drive Soviet troops out of the captured rooms were unsuccessful. The Red Army soldiers entrenched themselves in the building and methodically expanded their zone of control. The arrival of reinforcements made it possible to replace the tired assault groups and continue the offensive with new forces. The night assault proved the correctness of the Soviet command's new tactics. The stealthy infiltration of the building and simultaneous strikes from several directions broke the German defense. Although heavy fighting for the upper floors still lay ahead, the capture of the first floor was a turning point in the entire operation. By morning, it was clear that the fall of the Reichstag was only a matter of time. The German garrison suffered heavy losses and lost the ability to coordinate its defense. Soviet troops gained a secure base inside the building and were able to systematically advance to the upper floors. The fighting inside the Reichstag turned into a fierce battle for every room. The architectural features of the building provided many hiding places for the defenders, but at the same time gave the attackers opportunities to maneuver. Soviet soldiers used every opportunity to advance, turning every corridor and stairwell into a battlefield. The second floor proved particularly difficult to capture. The Germans turned the former offices of deputies into veritable pillboxes, installing machine guns in doorways and barricading the passageways with furniture. Each room had to be stormed separately, using grenades and flamethrowers. Soviet fighters suffered casualties, but steadily advanced. The staircases leading to the upper floors posed a particular problem. German machine gunners turned them into death zones, shooting every step. Soviet sappers were forced to find alternative routes, blowing up floors and creating passages through adjacent rooms. This work required not only technical skills, but also exceptional courage. The main hall of the Reichstag became the scene of the fiercest fighting. German Marines took up positions behind marble columns and desperately resisted every attempt by Soviet troops to gain a foothold in the hall. The high ceilings allowed the Germans to fire from the galleries, creating additional difficulties for the attackers. Soviet commanders employed the tactic of simultaneous attacks from different directions. While one group stormed the main entrance to the hall, others penetrated through side doors and breaches in the walls. This tactic allowed them to disperse the defenders' fire and gradually narrow the encirclement around the German positions. Soviet snipers played a special role in the fighting, taking up positions in the captured rooms and methodically destroying German firing points. Their accurate fire suppressed enemy machine guns and cleared the way for the assault groups. Each machine gun crew destroyed brought the moment of complete capture of the building closer. The third floor was taken by midday on May 1st. German resistance gradually weakened. Casualties and ammunition depletion made the defense less and less effective. Many defenders were demoralized by news of Hitler's suicide, which spread among the garrison despite attempts by the command to conceal this information. The fighting for the fourth floor was now sporadic. Most of the German soldiers retreated to the basements or surrendered. Small groups of fanatics continued to resist, but their scattered actions could not stop the advance of the Soviet troops. The way to the dome of the building was practically open. By the evening of May 1st, Soviet troops controlled most of the building. The remnants of the German garrison took refuge in the basement, where they continued to resist. However, the outcome of the fighting was already a foregone conclusion. The Reichstag was effectively in the hands of the Red Army. The final chord was the storming of the dome of the building. A group of Soviet soldiers under the command of Sergeant Kantaria climbed the internal staircase and broke into the rooms under the dome. The last defenders were waiting for them there, but their resistance was quickly broken. The way to the historic moment of raising the flag was open. The fighting inside the Reichstag demonstrated the high level of skill of the Soviet troops in urban conditions. The soldiers showed not only bravery, but also tactical competence, the ability to operate in difficult conditions and coordinate the actions of various units. The capture of the building became a model of a successful assault on a fortified object. The raising of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag became one of the most symbolic moments of the Great Patriotic War. But the real story behind this event turned out to be much more complicated than the widely publicized myth. The first flag was raised during the fighting on April 30th, but it was not preserved and was not photographed. The famous photo appeared later and was the result of a special staging. The first flag over the Reichstag was raised by Lieutenant Alexei Berest's scouts at around midnight on May 1st. The The group consisted of Sergeant Mikhail Kantaria, Junior Sergeant Meliton Varazashvili, and several other soldiers. They managed to break through to the dome of the building and hoist the red banner on an improvised pole made from a piece of the cornice. This flag was a simple red cloth without any inscriptions or symbols. It was made from materials at hand and was not very securely attached. A strong wind blowing over Berlin tore the flag down a few hours later, and it disappeared. No photographs were taken of this historic moment. Fierce fighting was underway, and photographers had no time for taking pictures. The second flag was raised on the morning of May 1st by a group led by Senior Sergeant Mikhail Igorov and Junior Sergeant Meliton Varazashvili. This flag was of better quality and bore the inscription 150th Idritskaya Rifle Division. The flag was secured more securely and lasted longer. It was this moment that was later accepted as the official raising of the victory flag. However, the second flag did not satisfy the Soviet command in terms of its propaganda effect. The flag hung unevenly, the building was badly damaged, and the overall view did not correspond to the solemnity of the moment. It was decided to organize a special photo session that would create the right image for history. On May 2nd, war correspondent and photographer Yevgeny Kaldey arrived in Berlin with the task of photographing the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. By this time, the fighting in the building had ended, and it was possible to organize the shoot without any problems. Kaldey brought with him a specially made banner that looked more impressive in photographs. The shoot took place on the dome of the Reichstag, in the presence of several Soviet soldiers who portrayed the participants in the assault. Kaldey took many shots, seeking the best angle and lighting. The most successful shot, in which a Soviet soldier raises the flag against the backdrop of a destroyed Berlin, became the famous photograph that went around the world. Some changes were made during the processing of the photograph. An extra watch was retouched from the hand of one of the soldiers so as not to give the impression of looting. Contrasts were also enhanced, and some details were emphasized for greater dramatic effect. These changes were common practice in military photography at the time. The staged nature of the famous photograph in no way diminishes the feat of the Soviet soldiers. The flag over the Reichstag was indeed raised during the fighting, and it became a symbol of victory over Nazism. Kaldey's photograph simply captured this symbolic moment in the most expressive form, creating an image that has been remembered by millions of people. The real story of the flag raising shows how historical symbols are born. Real events are often chaotic and poorly documented, but they become the basis for creating a more coherent and expressive narrative. The flag over the Reichstag remains a symbol of victory, regardless of the circumstances in which it was photographed. Today, the victory banner is kept in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow and is one of the main relics of the Great Patriotic War. It serves as a reminder of the feat of Soviet soldiers who reached the enemy's lair and put an end to the most terrible war in human history. The creation of Yevgeny Kaldey's famous photograph became a separate page in the history of the storming of the Reichstag. This photograph not only captured the moment of triumph, but also demonstrated the skill of Soviet military propaganda, which was able to create powerful visual images. The story behind the photograph shows how documentary images can become symbols of an era. Yevgeny Kaldey was assigned to photograph the flag over the Reichstag even before the building was completely captured. The photographer understood the historical significance of the moment and carefully prepared for the shoot. He even brought a special banner from Moscow, sewn to his order from a red tablecloth. The flag was larger than the usual battle banners and looked better in photographs. Arriving at the Reichstag on May 2nd, Kaldai discovered that the building was seriously damaged and its dome was partially destroyed. This created additional difficulties for the shoot, but at the same time provided an opportunity to show the scale of the destruction, symbolizing the collapse of Nazi Germany. The photographer chose several shooting locations and began planning the composition of future shots. The main problem was finding suitable models for the shoot. Many of the soldiers who had participated in the actual assault had already been transferred to other sections of the front or hospitalized. Haldane enlisted the help of several soldiers who were nearby, explaining to them the importance of the document he was creating. The shoot took place in several stages. First, Haldane took general shots of the building with the flag, then moved on to larger shots. The most famous photograph, in which a soldier raises the flag against the backdrop of a smoking Berlin, required several takes. The photographer sought the most expressive pose and the right lighting. Haldane paid particular attention to the background. The panorama of destroyed Berlin was intended to emphasize the scale of the victory and show what had become of the capital of the Third Reich. The smoke from the fires created a dramatic backdrop, and the ruins of buildings symbolized the collapse of the Nazi Empire. The composition of the photograph was carefully thought out. Some adjustments were made when processing the negatives in the field laboratory. The most famous change concerned the watches on the hands of one of the soldiers. Their number was reduced so as not to create the impression of looting. Contrasts were also enhanced, and some details were emphasized for greater dramatic effect. The photograph was sent to Moscow and quickly made the front pages of Soviet newspapers. The image made a huge impression on readers and became one of the most recognizable images of the war. It was subsequently reproduced in millions of copies and became a symbol of victory for several generations. The success of Haldane's photograph demonstrated the importance of visual propaganda in modern warfare. A single successful image could convey an idea to millions of people better than long texts or speeches. The photograph of the flag over the Reichstag became a classic example of war photojournalism and a model to emulate. Critics later pointed out the staged nature of the photograph, but this did not diminish its historical significance. Haldane created not just a documentary photograph, but an artistic image that accurately conveyed the essence of the historical moment. The flag over the Reichstag was indeed hoisted by Soviet soldiers, and the photograph simply captured this fact in the most expressive form. Today, Haldane's photograph is one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. It has become not only a historical document, but also a work of art that continues to influence viewers decades after its creation. The photographer's skill and the historical significance of the moment came together in a single frame, creating a true masterpiece. The last pockets of resistance in the Reichstag were suppressed only by the evening of May 2nd. Even after the flag was hoisted above the dome, individual groups of German soldiers continued to fight in the basement of the building. These battles were particularly fierce, as the defenders understood the hopelessness of their situation but did not want to surrender. The bulk of the German garrison took refuge in the deep basements of the Reichstag, where ammunition and food stores were located. The labyrinth of underground corridors became the last line of defense, where every turn could hide an ambush. Soviet troops had to literally smoke the enemy out of every hiding place. Mines and explosive devices installed by the Germans throughout the building posed a particular danger. Many traps were disguised as ordinary objects: books, paintings, furniture. Soviet sappers worked with extreme caution, but they were unable to avoid casualties entirely. Several Soviet soldiers were killed by explosions after the main fighting had ended. The commander of the German garrison, General Reimann, attempted to break through the Soviet positions, but this attempt ended in failure. Most of his soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. The general himself was seriously wounded and died from his injuries, not living to see the official end of the fighting for the building. The psychological impact on the last defenders proved to be no less important than the military action. Soviet soldiers used megaphones to call for surrender, explaining to the Germans the hopelessness of their situation. Propagandists reported Hitler's suicide and the collapse of all the plans of the Nazi leadership. This information had a strong effect on the morale of the garrison. The final surrender of the remnants of the German garrison did not take place until around noon on May 2nd. 32 soldiers and officers, including several seriously wounded, emerged from the basements. Many of them were in shock and could not believe that the war was over. The last to surrender was SS Gruppenführer Wilhelm Morgenländer, who had hoped until the very end that German reserves would arrive. The clearing of explosives from the building continued for several more days. Soviet sappers discovered and defused more than 50 mines of various types. Some explosive devices were so cleverly camouflaged that they were found even a week after the end of the fighting. Fortunately, most of the mines did not detonate due to damage to the detonators during the artillery bombardment. The tally of losses showed the high price of victory. Soviet troops lost more than 400 men killed and wounded in the fighting for the Reichstag building alone. German losses amounted to about 300 killed and 50 captured. The ratio of losses was typical for an assault on fortified positions in urban conditions. The capture of the Reichstag completed one of the most symbolic operations of the Great Patriotic War. The building, which embodied the power of the German Empire and later became a symbol of Nazi power, finally came under the control of the Red Army. The flag above its dome announced to the world the imminent end of the most terrible war in human history. The participants in the storming of the Reichstag represented a typical cross-section of the Red Army of 1945. They were battle-hardened soldiers and officers who had come a long way from the first border battles to the walls of the German capital. Many of them had participated in the largest operations of the war, but the storming of the Reichstag was a special test for them. The commander of the 1st Battalion of the 756th Rifle Regiment, Captain Stepan Neustroev, was a hereditary military man who had graduated from infantry school before the war. He took part in the battles near Moscow, Stalingrad, and in the Belarusian operation. Neustroev was distinguished by his personal bravery and ability to command a unit in the most difficult conditions. It was his battalion that was the first to storm the Reichstag building. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Berest commanded a reconnaissance platoon and was one of the most experienced officers in the division. Before the war, he worked as a teacher in a rural school, but the war forced him to radically change his life. Berest participated in the defense of Stalingrad and was wounded twice. He was the one who led the group that hoisted the flag over the Reichstag. Sergeant Mikhail Kantaria came from a peasant family in Georgia. He went to the front in 1942 and quickly proved himself to be a brave and reliable fighter. Kantaria rose from private to sergeant, participating in the liberation of Ukraine and Poland. During the storming of the Reichstag, he showed exceptional courage, risking his life several times. Junior Sergeant Meliton Varazashvili was also from Georgia and worked as a mechanic in a factory before the war. He was drafted into the army in the early days of the war and fought his way from the defense of the Caucasus to Berlin. Barazashvili was distinguished by his physical strength and ability to act in critical situations. Together with Kantaria, he was directly involved in raising the flag. Soviet sappers under the command of Captain Vladimir Makov played a special role in the assault. These specialists were responsible for clearing the approaches to the building and creating passages in the walls. Many of them had pre-war technical education and were able to solve the most complex engineering problems. Without their work, a successful assault would have been impossible. The rank-and-file soldiers who made up the bulk of the assault force represented all the peoples of the Soviet Union. Among them were Russian peasants from the central regions, Ukrainian workers from the Donbass, and Belarusian partisans who had joined the regular army. Many had lost family and friends in the war and saw the storming of the Reichstag as personal revenge. The ages of the participants in the assault ranged from 18 to 45. The youngest soldiers had been drafted in the last years of the war and gained combat experience during the liberation of Eastern Europe. Veterans from the early years of the war formed the backbone of the units and passed on their experience to the new recruits. They were all united by a common goal: to end the war with victory. The level of education among the assault troops was quite high for the army of that time. Many soldiers had secondary education, and among the officers there were engineers, teachers, and doctors who had become military personnel out of necessity. This feature of the Red Army allowed it to solve complex tactical problems and show initiative in critical situations. After the war, the fates of the participants in the assault varied. Many continued to serve in the army, while others returned to civilian professions. Some became heroes of the Soviet Union and received orders and medals. But the main reward for all of them was the realization that they had contributed to the great victory and the liberation of the world from Nazism. The memory of the participants in the storming of the Reichstag is preserved in museums, memorials, and books. Their names are engraved on memorial plaques, and their feat is studied in schools and military academies. These people became the living embodiment of the courage and self-sacrifice of the Soviet soldier, a symbol of the victory of good over evil in the most terrible war of the 20th century. The losses of the Soviet troops during the storming of the Reichstag were significant, which was the price paid for the symbolic importance of the operation. According to official data, 247 Soviet soldiers and officers were killed in the fighting for the parliament building alone, and more than 600 were wounded to varying degrees. These figures do not include losses in the fighting for the surrounding neighborhoods and approaches to the building. The 150th Rifle Division, which bore the brunt of the assault, suffered the heaviest losses. Its 756th Regiment alone lost 123 men killed and 281 wounded. The losses among the command staff amounted to 20%, which indicates that the officers led the soldiers into battle by personal example. The mortality rate was particularly high among junior commanders, sergeants, and second lieutenants. These men were the first to go into battle and the first to encounter enemy fire. Many of them died during the assault on the stairwells and corridors of the building, where the fiercest fighting took place. Their sacrifices ensured the success of the entire operation. Casualties among sappers and flamethrowers were proportionally even higher. These specialists performed the most dangerous work, creating passages through minefields and burning the enemy out of their shelters. Several sappers were blown up by their own charges while creating breaches in the walls. The work of flamethrowers in enclosed spaces was extremely risky. The medical service worked in extreme conditions. The wounded had to be evacuated under enemy fire, often over destroyed staircases and rubble. Several medics died while carrying the wounded from the upper floors of the building. The regimental medical station was set up in the basement of a neighboring building, from where the seriously wounded were sent to hospitals. The reasons for such high losses lay in the specifics of urban combat and the characteristics of the building itself. The architecture of the Reichstag gave many advantages to the defenders, while the attackers had to operate in areas that were easily exposed to fire. Every corridor and stairwell became an arena of fierce fighting, where the more determined side prevailed. German losses in the building itself were lower than Soviet losses, amounting to about 200 killed and 50 captured. This was because the defenders operated from cover and had defensive advantages. However, the Germans' overall losses in the fighting for the government quarter were significantly higher due to massive artillery bombardments. An analysis of the losses showed the high efficiency of the Soviet medical service. Most of the wounded were saved thanks to rapid evacuation and high-quality treatment. Many soldiers who were wounded in the storming of the Reichstag subsequently returned to duty and lived to see the complete victory over Germany. The price of capturing the Reichstag seemed excessively high against the backdrop of the imminent end of the war. Some critics later argued that the symbolic operation was not worth so many human lives. However, those who took part in the fighting felt differently. For them, capturing the symbol of Nazi power was of enormous moral significance. The families of the dead received notification of their deaths after the official end of the war in Europe. For many relatives, this was a particularly painful blow. Their loved ones had died in the very last days of the war, when victory was already close. The state undertook to provide for the widows and orphans of the fallen soldiers. The memory of those who died in the storming of the Reichstag was immortalized in various forms. Their names were engraved on memorial plaques installed at the sites of the battles. The personal belongings and documents of the fallen heroes were exhibited in museums. Writers and filmmakers created works telling the story of their feat. The veterans of the assault remembered their comrades who did not live to see victory for the rest of their lives. In their memories, the fallen are not abstract heroes, but living people with their own characters, dreams, and plans for post-war life. This human memory proved to be more important than official monuments and ceremonies. The heavy losses in the storming of the Reichstag were the last sacrifice that the Soviet people had to make on the altar of victory. These sacrifices were not in vain. They brought the end of the war and the liberation of the world from the Nazi yoke closer. The feet of those who fell in the last days of the war became part of the overall victory over fascism. The post-war mythologization of the storming of the Reichstag began almost immediately after the end of hostilities. The Soviet propaganda machine needed vivid images of victory, and the capture of the German parliament was ideal for this purpose. However, in the process of creating the official version of events, many details were distorted or simply invented. The first myth concerned the ease with which the building was taken. In the official version, the storming was presented as a swift operation that ended within a few hours. In reality, the fighting continued for several days, and the last defenders surrendered only on May 2nd. These details did not fit into the triumphant picture, so they were omitted. The second myth concerned the unity and heroism of all participants in the assault. Official propaganda portrayed Soviet soldiers as a single monolith, devoid of fear and doubt. In reality, many fighters experienced a natural fear of death, especially in the last days of the war. Some soldiers showed indecision, which was perfectly normal in combat conditions. The third myth concerned the size of the enemy and the ferocity of its resistance. In some versions, the Reichstag garrison numbered several thousand fanatical SS men ready to fight to the last. In reality, most of the defenders were poorly trained militiamen and remnants of regular units with low morale. Western historiography created its own myths about the storming of the Reichstag. Some authors portrayed Soviet soldiers as barbarians who destroyed cultural treasures and looted. Others exaggerated the military significance of the building, presenting it as a key stronghold of German defense. These distortions were caused by Cold War political motives. The myth that Soviet soldiers wrote obscene graffiti on the walls of the Reichstag has gained particular traction. Photographs of buildings with graffiti do exist, but most of the inscriptions appeared after the fighting had ended, when various military personnel visited the building. During the assault, the soldiers had no time for graffiti. The myth of widespread looting is also untrue. Although there were isolated cases of soldiers taking trophies, there was no mass looting. The Soviet command strictly prohibited such actions, understanding their propaganda damage. Most soldiers were disciplined military personnel carrying out a combat mission. The debunking of myths began only after the archives were opened, and the memoirs of participants in the events were published. Historians gained access to documents that allowed them to reconstruct the true picture of the assault. It turned out that the real story is no less interesting than its mythologized versions. Contemporary researchers strive for an objective account of events based on documentary sources. They take into account both Soviet and German evidence, compare different versions, and try to find out the truth. This approach allows for a more complete and accurate picture of what happened. Debunking myths does not diminish the feat of Soviet soldiers. On the contrary, it shows that real people performed real heroic deeds without needing to embellish their actions. The true story of the storming of the Reichstag is no less impressive than its mythologized version. It is important to understand that myths about the war were not created solely for propaganda purposes. They helped people make sense of the traumatic experience of war and find meaning in their suffering and losses. Myths provided simple answers to complex questions and created a sense of justice in the historical process. The fight against myths must be conducted carefully, with an understanding of their social function. It is not enough to simply destroy established ideas without offering an equally convincing narrative in their place. The story of the storming of the Reichstag should remain a story of heroism, but of real heroism, not fictional. The modern understanding of events is based on recognizing the complexity and contradictions of historical processes. The storming of the Reichstag was both a heroic feat and a tragedy, a military necessity and a political symbol. Only by taking all these aspects into account can we create a complete picture of the past. The historical significance of the capture of the Reichstag goes far beyond a specific military operation. This episode became a symbol of the final collapse of the Third Reich and the triumph of justice over evil. The fall of the building, which once housed the German parliament and later served as a venue for Nazi rallies, signified the end of the 1,000-year Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years. The capture of the Reichstag demonstrated to the whole world that Nazi Germany had been finally defeated. The Soviet flag flying above the dome of the building was visible proof that the army, which Hitler considered invincible, had suffered a crushing defeat. This image spread around the world and became one of the most recognizable symbols of World War II. The symbolic significance of the operation was no less important than its military significance. The Reichstag represented not only German statehood, but also European civilization as a whole. Its capture by Soviet troops symbolized the liberation of Europe from the fascist yoke and the restoration of democratic values. The red banner above the building became a sign of a new era. The capture of the Reichstag was the culmination of the Great Patriotic War for the Soviet people. This moment symbolized not only military victory, but also moral triumph. The people who had survived the siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and other trials had reached the enemy's lair and won the final victory. The international significance of the event was enormous. The capture of the Reichstag proved the decisive role of the Soviet Union in the defeat of Nazi Germany. This event strengthened the position of the USSR in the post-war world and demonstrated the power of the Red Army. The allies of the anti-Hitler coalition were forced to acknowledge the outstanding contribution of the Soviet people to the overall victory. The propaganda effect of the capture of the Reichstag proved to be long-lasting. The image of a Soviet soldier hoisting a flag above the dome of the building became one of the main symbols of the victory over fascism. This image was used in thousands of posters, films, and monuments, shaping the collective memory of the war for several generations. The military historical significance of the operation lies in demonstrating the high level of training of the Red Army by the end of the war. The storming of the Reichstag showed that Soviet troops had mastered the art of urban combat and could successfully solve the most complex tactical tasks. This was the result of combat experience accumulated over 4 years of war. The capture of the Reichstag had important political consequences. It finally buried the Nazi leadership's plans to create an Alpine fortress and continue resistance. The fall of the capital demoralized the remnants of the German army and hastened the country's surrender. The war in Europe ended a week after the assault. The psychological impact of the event on the German population was enormous. The capture of the Reichstag finally convinced the Germans of the futility of further resistance. Many realized that Nazi propaganda about the invincibility of the German army was a lie, and promises of miracle weapons were empty words. For the peoples of occupied Europe, the capture of the Reichstag became a symbol of liberation. The French, Poles, Czechs, Yugoslavs, and representatives of other nations saw the Soviet flag flying over the German parliament as a sign of their liberation from fascist oppression. This event gave hope to millions of people who had suffered under Nazi occupation. The historical memory of the storming of the Reichstag remains to this day. In Russia, this episode remains one of the main symbols of the Great Patriotic War. In Germany, it is viewed more cautiously, but its historical significance as the moment that marked the end of Nazi dictatorship is recognized. A modern understanding of the storming of the Reichstag must take into account all aspects of this event: military, political, and symbolic. It was not just the capture of a building, but an important historical milestone that marked the transition from war to peace, from dictatorship to democracy, from hatred to hope for a better future. The lesson of history from the storming of the Reichstag is that evil, no matter how powerful it may seem, will inevitably be defeated in the face of the united forces of good. Nazi Germany, which had conquered almost all of Europe, was defeated by a coalition of free nations. The flag over the Reichstag became a symbol of this great victory.